Hello, and thank you for tuning in to our presentation. This is the Gender Pay Gap presented by Ryan Delaney and Dylan Kang. My name is Ryan Delaney, and I will be presenting the first half of today's presentation. We would like to begin by giving you a brief overview of what we will cover in today's presentation. First, we will look at the trends in the gender pay gap, which can be observed over the past 50 years or so. Next, we will cover the reasons that most economists believe best explain the existence of the gender pay gap. After this, we'll dive a little deeper into why certain trends occurred during both the 1980s and 1990s. And finally, we'll finish our presentation with a few possible outcomes for the future. So to start off, let's take a look at how the difference between earnings by men and earnings by women have changed over the past 50 years. Let me begin by giving you a little more information about this figure to the right. This graph shows us the earnings ratio, or the percentage earned by women relative to men, from 1955 until 2003. As you can see, the graph includes both weekly and annual earnings of full-time workers. The researchers who collected this data chose to focus solely on full-time workers to avoid certain inaccuracies. For instance, women are more likely to work part-time than men. Also, one other note, while there is a difference between the weekly and annual earnings, this discrepancy is unimportant and the main trends we will discuss are mirrored by both figures. Between the years of 1955 to around 1980, there was a period of roughly 25 years in which women's wages were for the most part stable relative to the wages earned by men. While the exact percentage does vary year to year, it remains within the range of 64% to 57%. If we were to highlight any specific pattern, it would be the very sharp decrease between the years of 1955 and 1960. Beginning in the late 1970s, we begin to see a sharp increase in the rate of convergence. Within a period of around 10 years, the percentage of women's wages relative to men's increases from 59% to 72%. After this quick upturn, the rate of convergence continues to increase but slows down significantly between the years of 1990 until 2000. During this 10-year period, the earnings ratio increases only 4%, from 72 to 76%, compared to the 13% increase we observed in the previous 10-year span. Finally, there is a short increase in the earnings ratio during the early 2000s, but as you can see, it begins to slope downwards right at the end of the graph. So we've covered the basic patterns that the gender pay gap has followed over the past 25 years. When we look at the gains that have been made since the 1970s, the difference is quite remarkable. This progress appears even more significant or interesting because of three other characteristics, the first of which has to do with age. The increase in the earnings by women were not concentrated to a certain age group. In fact, the rising earnings ratio took place across the entire spectrum of age. While the increases were initially focused on young women, they eventually expanded to encompass women of all ages. An extremely similar characteristic was observed in regard to education. Just as women of all ages were able to narrow the pay gap with men of all ages, women with varying levels of education were able to accomplish the same feat. The earnings of women with low levels of education increased relative to men with similar education levels, while women with high levels of education were able to do the same with highly educated males. With these two factors considered, the third characteristic of the shifting earnings ratio is the most notable. The past 25 years or so have been a period of rising inequality. This means that the significant convergence of the gender pay gap occurred during a time when pay differences between low-wage and high-wage workers were rising rapidly. So far during the presentation, I have spoken a good amount about the progress that has been made in regard to narrowing the difference between what men and women earn. However, the gender pay gap still exists, and it is by no means insignificant. The last few trends that we have looked at earlier leave economists uncertain about the future. The rate of convergence begins to slow during the 1990s, and many people are unsure if this is signaling a stall in the increase of women's earnings or not. Following this, larger gains were made in the early 2000s, but they were quite short-lived and began to slope downwards during 2002 and 2003. economists are still unsure of the long-run significance of this quick increase. Many believe it could begin a period of plateauing convergence, while others believe it could simply be a brief pause in the upward trend that we have observed. We are now going to move on to the section in which we take a look at how most economists explain the existence of the gender pay gap. Based on the information available in the reading, economists focus primarily on two main factors, known as gender-specific factors. These concepts are considered gender-specific as they relate specifically to differences between men and women, either in regard to their qualifications or how they are treated. When discussing qualifications, most economists use the human capital model to highlight the roles played by education and experience. Historically, the gender gap in education was never too extreme. However, while women were more likely to graduate high school, men were more likely to go on to receive college or graduate education. Along with this, it was more common for men to focus on career-oriented fields such as engineering, law, or medicine. These professions typically earn higher wages, which can contribute to the gender pay gap. These differences in education levels have disappeared in recent years, and in fact, actually favor women who now make up more than half of the people attending college. Economists state that educational differences have never adequately explained the wage gap. The qualification that has proven to be more important is experience. Historically, women would leave the workplace once they were married and had children. Post-World War II, women began to return to the labor force once their children were grown up or out of school. In the past 20 to 30 years, we have seen a shift towards women remaining in the workforce even when young children are in the picture. Regardless, women on average have less work experience than their male counterparts, and many economists believe this is extremely important in explaining the wage gap. Because women historically have had shorter and less continuous work lives, they've had less incentive to invest in positions with lots of on-the-job training and formal education. This results in less human capital, which in turn explains the lower wages relative to their male counterparts. Another component of this idea is the additional time spent on housework often caused a decrease in productivity and then wages when working. Regardless of the difference in qualifications that can be easily measured, pay differences exist that economists believe are due to discrimination in the labor market. Some of the models used for labor discrimination were originally formed for studying discrimination between race, but can easily be applied and used to study discrimination between men and women. One researcher conceptualized discriminatory preferences as the desire to maintain social distance from the discriminated group. In Becker's model, he says that discrimination stems from the tastes of employers, coworkers, or customers. In the model of statistical discrimination, differences in the treatment of the genders form from the differences in perceived value of productivity, or the idea that one gender will on average outperform the other. Finally, the overcrowding model states that the exclusion of women from jobs typically held by men creates an excess of female labor in the market, and thus brings down wages. These three models work to explain the origins of different kinds of gender discrimination in the market. Now that we've outlined some of the potential reasons for the existence of the gender pay gap, we can see how researchers typically analyze these causes. They do this by estimating wage regressions for the relationship between wages and productivity-related characteristics for men and women. Once this is completed, the pay gap can be split into two categories: measured characteristics due to gender differences and unexplained characteristics that may be the result of discrimination. This process provides consistent evidence that differences in human capital and labor market discrimination are both causes of the gender pay gap. If you look at the table shown here, you will see that there is a list of 6 characteristics. Next to these characteristics is the percentage of the earnings ratio difference that each concept is said to explain. The most important characteristics listed here are educational attainment, labor force experience, occupational category, and industry category. The percent explained by education is listed as roughly -7%. This means that the average education level of women helps to reduce the pay gap by 7%. Next, the difference in labor force experience between men and women is said to account for roughly 11% of the difference in earnings. This 11% is equivalent to 3.5 years of full-time experience. Finally, the choices men and women make in regard to occupations and industries account for roughly 50% of the difference in earnings between the two genders. After looking at these different characteristics, we see that the wage differential is listed as around 20%. This means that the actual or unadjusted gender wage ratio is 80%, or that women's wages are on average 80% of men's wages. If this number was adjusted, so women and men were said to have the same human capital characteristics or levels of education and experience, the number would rise to 91%. This shows us that there is still a difference in wages, unexplained by the other characteristics. One potential answer to this was the fact that women often left the workforce once they had a child. However, more and more women have continued to work regardless of children, and this factor is becoming decreasingly important. In order to test the effect of discrimination on the pay gap, various studies were conducted, including the use of pseudo jobs and blind auditions. The resumes of both male and female candidates for restaurant serving positions were given to an employer. The researchers found that the female candidate's chances of receiving an interview were 40 percentage points lower than the male's, and the probability of her receiving an offer was 50 percentage points lower. Mirroring the idea that discrimination was the cause of this difference was the result of a study focusing on blind auditions. This term describes the practice of hiring a musician solely based on their performance, and where the musician remains hidden to the judges. Once blind auditions grew in popularity, the number of female musicians involved in the top 5 orchestras in the United States rose from 5% in 1970 to 25% in 1996. Both of these studies help show the effect discrimination has on the existence of the gender wage gap.